Hundreds and even thousands of French women were raped by American soldiers between 1944 and their departure in April 1946. 80 years later, memories resurface and tongues loosen, undermining the myth of the liberator hero. As the Allied troops advanced inland from the beaches, French civilians faced a new reality. The presence of foreign soldiers, initially greeted with gratitude and relief, soon brought fear and uncertainty for many women. Reports of rape and sexual assault began to emerge in towns and villages throughout Normandy. These reports, though initially scattered and often understated, highlighted a serious problem that would become more prominent in the weeks following the invasion. What is less known is that a few months later, in October 1944, at the end of the decisive Battle of Normandy, American military authorities tried 152 soldiers for the rape of French women. A grossly underestimated figure, claims Mary Louise Roberts, one of the few historians who has studied this great taboo of World War II. Many women preferred to remain silent. In addition to the shame associated with rape, the atmosphere was one of joy, of celebrating the liberators. To motivate soldiers to fight so far from home, the army promised them a France populated with easy women. The newspaper Stars and Stripes, published by the US Armed Forces and eagerly read by thousands of soldiers deployed in Europe, was full of photographs of French women kissing the liberators. "The French women are crazy about the Yankees. This is what we fight for," headlined the newspaper on September 9, 1944. The prospect of sex motivated American soldiers to fight, and it was, particularly through prostitution and rape, a way to dominate France, to dominate the French who had been unable to protect their country and their women from the Germans, explains Mary Louise Roberts. It can be estimated that hundreds, if not thousands, of other rapes committed by American soldiers went unreported between 1944 and the soldiers' departure in April 1946. The chaotic environment of the war zone made maintaining order and discipline among the troops difficult. Units were often dispersed, and communication lines were strained, allowing some soldiers to act with impunity. For the women of Normandy, this meant living under the constant threat of violence from the very soldiers who had come to liberate them. Many of these women were too afraid to report the assaults, fearing reprisals or disbelief. The stigma associated with rape, along with the turmoil of war, silenced many victims. The American military command received numerous reports of sexual violence, but the immense scale of the invasion and ongoing battles made it difficult to address these issues effectively. Military police and local authorities struggled to keep up with the growing number of cases, and justice for many victims remained elusive. The impact of these assaults on the French civilian population was profound. For many women, the trauma of rape was compounded by the betrayal of trust in their liberators. The psychological scars left by these attacks were deep and long-lasting. Families were broken, and communities were left dealing with the aftermath of violence. The promise of liberation had brought hope, but for those who suffered sexual violence, it also brought a new kind of horror. They were drunk and needed a woman. For 80 years, Aimée Dupré preferred to remain silent about the rape suffered by her mother in 1944. But as a new celebration of the Allied landings in France approached, she no longer wanted to remain silent. The rape was committed by 2 American soldiers, an act of war. In her small Breton village in Mortars, Aimée is 19 years old and, like all her neighbors, is happy about the arrival of these liberators who announce the end of the German occupation. But very quickly, she becomes disillusioned. On the evening of August 10th, 2 soldiers entered the family farm. They were drunk and needed a woman, she modestly summarizes to AFP, who was 99 years old at the time of the interview. From an old piece of furniture, she takes out a letter her mother, Aimée Élodie Honoré, wrote to her daughter, so as not to forget anything. With careful handwriting, the farmer first recounts how the soldiers shot her husband, the bullets piercing his beret, and then turned threateningly towards her daughter. "I went out to protect her, and they took me to the field, raped me 4 times each, taking turns," she recalls. 80 years later, her daughter's voice breaks as she reads it. "Oh, Mom, you suffered, and I think about it every day," she whispers. "Mom sacrificed herself to protect me." While they were raping her, we waited in the night, not knowing if she would come back alive or if they would shoot her. In Plabennec, not far from Brest, Jeanne Tournelec, 95, remembered, as if it were yesterday, the rape of her older sister Catherine and the murder of her father by a soldier. The Black American wanted to rape my older sister. My father intervened, and the soldier shot him. The man managed to break down the door and enter the house, she recounts, surrounded by her nieces. But it was the liberation. Everyone was happy. I wasn't going to say something like that. They wouldn't believe me. Catherine Plassard, a rape victim, confessed it to her daughter. Then, at 9 years old, the girl ran to inform an American garrison stationed in Loch Maria, a few kilometers away. I said it was a German. I was wrong. When they saw the bullets the next day, they immediately understood it was an American, she said. Catherine kept this secret that poisoned her throughout her life inside, until she neared death and confided in Janine Plassard, one of her daughters. In her hospital bed, she said, "I was raped during the war, during the liberation." Her daughter then asked if she managed to talk to anyone about it. Talk to someone about that? But it was the liberation. Everyone was happy. I wasn't going to say something like that. They wouldn't believe me. The US Army reacted by bringing soldiers guilty of crimes before military tribunals. Some were sentenced to death and executed. Most of the convicted were African Americans, casting doubt on the impartiality of the US Army in these criminal cases. Of the 116 soldiers court-martialed in France, 67 were sentenced to life imprisonment, most of them being black. Additionally, 34 soldiers were executed for crimes against French citizens or refugees. Of these, 21 were arrested for rape, and the majority were also black. In total, 49 soldiers were sentenced to death for rape, but more than half had their sentences commuted to life imprisonment. Military tribunals imposed harsher sentences on African American soldiers than on white soldiers. The perpetrators were executed, as in the case of Clarence Whitfield, who was sentenced to death by hanging on June 20, 1944, in Canarsie by a court-martial. Thus, the US Army executed 29 soldiers for rape, including 25 African Americans. US military authorities invited the victims to witness the execution of the culprits. According to journalist Laurent Joffrin, US military tribunals had a lamentable tendency to especially punish black soldiers and to treat the same events with much more leniency when they involved white soldiers. The US Army was then a racist institution that used blacks as scapegoats to maintain its image in France. The French, sometimes never having seen a black person, reacted according to the worst colonial stereotypes of the hypersexualized savage. During the summer of 1944, 40% of the accused with "killed by the blacks," and at least one grave of a husband of a raped woman with the inscription "Killed by the blacks." Warriors in the shadows, colonial troops and discrimination on D-Day. Approximately 160,000 Allied troops landed in Normandy. Of those, 73,000 were from the United States and 83,000 were from Britain and Canada. French troops fighting under General Charles de Gaulle also played a crucial role. However, the contributions of colonial troops, particularly those from African and Asian colonies, are often overlooked. These soldiers faced significant disparities in treatment and recognition compared to their Western counterparts. Colonial troops from the British and French empires were fundamental to the success of Operation Overlord. They were recruited from diverse regions, including Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. Despite their significant contributions, these troops often faced discrimination and unequal conditions. They were typically assigned support roles rather than frontline combat positions, reflecting the racial hierarchies and prejudices of the time. African troops, many from French colonies such as Senegal, were among those who faced harsh treatment. They were often given the most dangerous and exhausting tasks, such as clearing minefields and handling supplies, while receiving lower pay and fewer opportunities for advancement than their white counterparts. Their living conditions were generally worse, with limited access to the same level of medical care and rest facilities. This disparity in treatment also extended to Asian troops, including those from India serving under British command. These soldiers were also relegated to support roles and faced similar discriminatory practices. Despite these challenges, colonial troops demonstrated remarkable bravery and resilience. They fought alongside Allied forces in various capacities, from infantry and artillery units to engineering and logistics support. Their presence was crucial in maintaining the momentum of the invasion and ensuring a steady supply of materials and reinforcements. The success of the Normandy invasion and subsequent operations relied heavily on the contributions of these soldiers. The lack of recognition for colonial troops has been a problematic aspect of World War II history. While Western Allied forces received widespread recognition for their roles in liberating France, the sacrifices and achievements of colonial soldiers were often minimized or ignored. Colonial troops frequently faced some of the hardest battles during the campaign. They were often deployed on the front lines in some of the most dangerous and strategically crucial operations. These assignments reflected the High Command's willingness to exploit colonial labor while preserving European troops for other tasks. For instance, colonial units were heavily involved in the Battle of Monte Cassino and the arduous Italian campaign before being deployed in Normandy. Their roles in these fierce battles were marked by high casualty rates, underscoring the dangerous nature of their assignments. Inequalities extended beyond the battlefield. Colonial troops were housed in separate and often inferior accommodations compared to European soldiers. They were provided with lower quality rations and had less access to recreational facilities. Medical care for wounded colonial soldiers was also of lower quality, and they were often treated in segregated facilities. This unequal treatment reflected the broader colonial attitudes of the time, viewing non-European soldiers as expendable resources rather than valuable members of the military effort. Moreover, colonial troops had limited opportunities for advancement. Promotions and leadership positions were largely reserved for European soldiers, regardless of the contributions and capabilities of the colonial troops. This systemic discrimination hindered the career progression of many talented soldiers from the colonies, relegating them to lower ranks and preventing them from receiving the recognition and rewards their service deserved. However, the disparities in treatment and recognition also highlight the deeply entrenched racial and colonial prejudices that persisted even in the context of a global war against tyranny. The experiences of colonial troops serve as a reminder of the complexities and contradictions of the Allied war effort. While fighting for freedom and democracy, the Allies also perpetuated colonial systems that denied those very principles to millions of people. Under siege, the psychological toll on American soldiers. Many American soldiers experienced extreme stress due to the constant threat of death, battlefield confusion, and the brutality of combat. Some suffered nervous breakdowns and other long-term psychological traumas. During D-Day and other intense combat situations, soldiers experienced significant stress, which manifested in various ways. The high-pressure environment often led to increased irritability and sudden outbursts of anger. Soldiers found themselves in situations where the slightest miscommunication or mistake could have fatal consequences. This constant vigilance created an atmosphere where tempers flared easily and patience wore thin quickly. The inability to predict or control their environment added to the frustration, making even minor problems seem insurmountable. As a result, many soldiers quickly became angry, sometimes directing their frustration toward their fellow soldiers or superiors, further straining the already tense dynamics within the units. The persistent danger of the battlefield also resulted in excessive fear and worry. Soldiers faced the daily reality of potentially losing their lives or witnessing the death of their comrades, which contributed to ongoing anxiety and fear. This continuous exposure to life-threatening situations heightened their sense of vulnerability and often left them in a state of perpetual anxiety. The ever-present possibility of sudden death or serious injury from enemy fire, mines, or ambushes meant that soldiers could never fully relax or feel safe. The relentless stress wore down their mental resilience, leading them to a state of hypervigilance where every sound or movement was perceived as a potential threat. Physical symptoms were also common. The physical and mental strain of combat could result in headaches and extreme fatigue. The relentless pace of operations, combined with the need for constant alertness, left soldiers exhausted. Harsh conditions and the lack of adequate rest further exacerbated these symptoms, making it difficult for soldiers to maintain their physical and mental health. Grueling marches, heavy equipment, and exposure to the elements took a toll on their bodies, while the mental strain of constant danger and decision-making led to chronic headaches and fatigue. This combination of physical and mental exhaustion affected their ability to think clearly and perform their tasks effectively, increasing the risk of mistakes and accidents. The psychological impact of witnessing traumatic events could lead to feelings of sadness, hopelessness, and emotional numbness, commonly known as depression and apathy. Many soldiers struggle to maintain their morale while repeatedly exposed to the horrors of war. The emotional impact of seeing friends and comrades wounded or killed, combined with the stress of their own survival, contributed to a profound sense of hopelessness and detachment. Continuous exposure to death and destruction numbed their emotional responses, making it difficult to feel joy or hope. This emotional numbness served as a coping mechanism, helping soldiers function in the short term but often leading to long-term psychological issues once the immediate danger had passed. Stress could also affect soldiers' eating habits, leading to a loss of appetite. The stress and anxiety experienced by soldiers often interfered with their ability to eat, resulting in reduced appetite and weight loss. This further weakened their physical condition, making it even more challenging to face the demands of combat. The disruption of normal eating patterns added to the overall strain on their bodies, making recovery and resilience even more difficult. Soldiers often found it hard to digest food, either due to constant tension or because their minds were preoccupied with the dangers around them. The lack of proper nutrition further depleted their energy levels, contributing to a cycle of physical and mental decline. Sleep problems were also prevalent. The constant threat and adrenaline rush disrupted sleep patterns, making it difficult for soldiers to get the rest they needed. Nightmares and insomnia were common, and many soldiers found it hard to relax even when they had the opportunity to sleep. The inability to rest adequately left them in a constant state of fatigue, further affecting their ability to perform in combat and manage stress. The sounds of battle, fear of night attacks, and uncomfortable sleeping conditions made it nearly impossible to achieve restorative sleep. As a result, soldiers often resorted to catching brief moments of sleep wherever and whenever they could. But this fragmented sleep was insufficient to restore their energy or mental clarity. These symptoms highlight the immense psychological toll that wartime experiences took on soldiers during D-Day and beyond. The extreme stress experienced by American soldiers was a significant factor in their overall well-being and ability to perform in combat. Despite rigorous training and preparation, nothing could fully prepare soldiers for the reality of combat. The constant threat of death, battlefield chaos, and brutality of combat created an environment of extreme stress. Soldiers had to navigate these challenges while maintaining their focus and executing their missions. The psychological cost of this experience left many with deep and lasting scars, impacting their mental health long after the war had ended. For some, the memories of the battlefield and the stress they endured continued to haunt them, manifesting in various forms of long-term psychological trauma. The story of these soldiers underscores the harsh realities of war and the profound impact it has on those who serve on the front lines. Many soldiers returned home with what is now recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life and cope with their experiences. Shadows of fear, anti-German propaganda and its impact on D-Day. During D-Day and the European campaign, the United States extensively used propaganda to demonize the Germans and boost Allied morale. Anti-German propaganda served as a powerful tool to shape public opinion and mobilize support for the war effort. One of the main themes was the demonization of the enemy. Propaganda depicted Germans as ruthless aggressors, emphasizing their brutality and inhumanity. Posters, films, and radio broadcasts often portrayed German soldiers as barbaric and merciless, committing atrocities against civilians and prisoners of war. This portrayal aimed to foster hatred and unite the Allied nations against a common enemy. By dehumanizing the Germans, propaganda sought to justify the sacrifices required for the war and strengthen the resolve of both soldiers and civilians. Heroic sacrifice was another key theme. Propaganda highlighted the bravery and sacrifices of Allied soldiers, presenting them as defenders of freedom and democracy. Stories of valor and selflessness were widely disseminated to boost morale and encourage enlistment. Images of soldiers in action, often shown in noble and heroic poses, were designed to inspire pride and a sense of duty. This narrative reinforced the idea that the fight against Germany was not only necessary, but also a noble and just cause. The role of women was also emphasized in propaganda efforts. The contributions of women to the war effort, whether on the home front or in auxiliary roles, were celebrated and encouraged. Posters and films depicted women working in factories, serving as nurses and supporting troops in various capacities. This message aimed to mobilize the female workforce and maintain morale at home, emphasizing that everyone had a role to play in achieving victory. Women were portrayed as vital to the war effort, and their sacrifices and hard work were presented as crucial to the Allies' success. Conservation and sacrifice were themes that resonated strongly with the civilian population. Posters urged civilians to conserve resources, buy war bonds, and participate in rationing. Sacrifices were presented as essential to victory, and the public was constantly reminded of the importance of supporting the war effort through personal actions. This message created a sense of collective responsibility and unity, encouraging people to endure hardships for the greater good. The idea that every small contribution helped the war effort reinforced the collective spirit needed to sustain the long and grueling conflict. Careless talk was also a focus of propaganda. Campaigns warned against careless talk that could aid the enemy, emphasizing that loose lips sink ships. This theme underscored the importance of secrecy and vigilance, reminding both civilians and military personnel to be cautious about what they said and to whom they said it. The fear of espionage and the potential consequences of reckless comments created a culture of caution and heightened awareness, contributing to overall security. Anti-German scenarios were frequently depicted in propaganda materials. Some posters portrayed Germans as threatening invaders, reinforcing the urgency of defeating them. These images played on fears of invasion and occupation, depicting a dire future if the Germans were not stopped. These scenarios were designed to galvanize public support for the war, emphasizing the existential threat posed by the German army. Depicting the Germans as a direct and imminent danger helped maintain the momentum of the war effort and kept the public engaged and supportive. A massive propaganda operation also took place, where specially equipped bombers dropped millions of leaflets over the Normandy beaches on D-Day. In 2 days, 9 million leaflets were dropped, reaching both friends and foes. Allied propagandists had amassed expertise from civilian and military personnel for this effort. These leaflets aimed to inform civilians and soldiers about Allied progress and intentions, as well as demoralize German troops by highlighting the futility of their resistance. Radio broadcasts were also an essential part of the propaganda campaign. The Voice of SHAEF, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, began broadcasting in Europe on May 19, 1944. These broadcasts provided updates on the progress of the invasion, transmitted messages of encouragement to occupied populations, and disseminated misinformation to confuse and demoralize the enemy. The ability to reach a wide audience quickly made radio an invaluable tool in the arsenal of psychological warfare. The 422nd American Special Leaflet Squadron played a crucial role in propaganda efforts. They preceded the Allied bomber force in France, dropping warning leaflets for civilians and special instructions for transportation workers. These leaflets were designed to minimize civilian casualties and disrupt German logistics by advising transportation workers on how to sabotage German efforts without endangering their own lives. This strategy aimed to weaken the German war machine from within while preserving the lives of non-combatants. However, the main target of the propaganda campaign was the Wehrmacht. Although there was some controversy around distributing leaflets to friendly civilians, the primary thrust of the effort was directed at German soldiers. The goal was to stimulate defeatism within the German army, which faced encirclement and the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. The leaflets often highlighted the hopelessness of the German cause, the overwhelming strength of Allied forces, and the possibility of humane treatment for those who surrendered. This psychological pressure aimed to erode the fighting spirit of German troops and hasten the collapse of German resistance. These themes aimed to unify nations, increase patriotism, and sustain the war effort. The extensive use of anti-German propaganda by the United States during World War II played a critical role in shaping public perception and maintaining support for the Allies. By creating a clear and compelling narrative of good versus evil, the propaganda efforts helped to unite the nation and ensure a cohesive and determined response to the challenges of the war. The impact of this propaganda was profound, influencing both the home front and the front lines and contributing to the eventual success of Allied forces in the European theatre. The Battle for Paris, the fight to liberate France. The liberation of France during World War II stands as a remarkable achievement characterized by strategic military maneuvers, political diplomacy, and the tireless efforts of the Allied forces, the Free French forces, and the French resistance. The culmination of these efforts in August 1944 marked a significant turning point in the war, leading to the eventual expulsion of German forces from French territory. The initial phase of the liberation began with Operation Overlord on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day. This operation saw the largest amphibious assault in history, as over 2 million Allied troops, including a French armored division, landed on the beaches of Normandy. The objective was to establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied France and begin the advance inland. Despite numerous casualties and fierce German resistance, the Allies secured the beaches and initiated their advance through the Norman countryside. The Allies faced significant challenges in the weeks following D-Day. The advance stalled amidst the thick hedgerows of Normandy and entrenched German positions, leading to brutal and close-quarters combat. However, the Allies gradually pushed the Germans back, culminating in a breakthrough in July with Operation Cobra. This offensive, led by American forces, aimed to break through the Norman bocage and advance southward. The operation was successful, and Allied forces moved forward, liberating towns and villages as they progressed. In early August, the Allies launched Operation Dragoon, a second offensive in southern France. This operation involved Allied landings along the French Riviera, including troops from the French Army B. The landings in the south encountered less resistance compared to Normandy, allowing for a rapid advance. The Allied forces moved northward, joining those advancing from Normandy, effectively squeezing the German forces between two fronts. The role of the French resistance was crucial during this period. Resistance fighters carried out sabotage operations, gathered intelligence, and assisted Allied forces with guerrilla tactics. Their efforts disrupted German supply lines, communications, and troop movements, creating additional pressure on the occupying forces. The resistance also played a crucial role in the liberation of Paris. The liberation of Paris almost did not occur in the summer of 1944. For American and British military officials, Paris was not a high priority. They viewed the capture of the French capital as secondary to the primary Allied objective, ending the war in Europe quickly by forcing Germany's surrender. This urgency was partly due to the desire to shift focus to the Pacific theater and the war against Japan. After the initial landings on the Normandy beaches, the Allied advance stalled for several weeks due to challenging terrain and German resistance. Even after breaking the Normandy encirclement in early August, Generals Dwight Eisenhower and Omar Bradley considered Paris an unnecessary diversion that would slow the Allied advance toward Germany. They wanted to avoid the kind of house-to-house urban combat that had bogged down the Germans in Stalingrad, and were cautious of the logistical challenges of feeding the city's nearly 2 million residents. For Charles de Gaulle, however, bypassing Paris was unthinkable. While the city's value as a military objective was limited, its symbolic importance was immense. Whoever liberated Paris would gain a significant advantage in shaping the post-war political landscape of France. De Gaulle was determined that this advantage should fall to the Free French Army rather than British or American forces or other resistance groups. Events on the ground eventually made the debate irrelevant. On August 18, 1944, a general strike broke out across Paris in reaction to news of the Allied advance. 2 days later, barricades appeared throughout the city, signaling Parisian discontent. Resistance units in Paris began to mobilize, clashing with the occupying German troops. Despite their reluctance to divert the Allied advance, Eisenhower authorized the French 2nd Armored Division to take the city on August 22, 1944. The composition of the troops involved in the liberation of Paris was a source of controversy. As the only French unit to participate in Operation Overlord, the 2nd Armoured Division had extensive combat experience and was led by a capable commander, General Philippe Leclerc. For American and British officers, the division's greatest asset was its demographic composition. The division had a higher proportion of white soldiers than the Free French Army in general, which was largely composed of soldiers from France's African colonies. This racial calculus was explicit in the decision-making process, as evidenced by a confidential memo from Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Bedell Smith, advocating the use of predominantly white personnel. Many soldiers were Spanish Republicans who had joined the French resistance after fleeing Francisco Franco's fascist regime. From liberation to division, French views on allies and occupiers. During and after the liberation of France, French opinions about the Germans and Americans were diverse and complex. The experiences of occupation and liberation left deep impressions on the French population, shaping their views in multifaceted ways. Some French people, particularly those who had collaborated with the Germans or found stability during the occupation, came to prefer the German occupation over the presence of Allied forces. This was partly due to abuses committed by some Allied soldiers, such as looting and rape, which tarnished the image of the liberators. The relationship between the French and Americans was equally nuanced. During World War II, the United States provided significant aid to France, including military assistance and efforts toward liberation. However, the American combat against Vichy France while simultaneously supporting Free France created a complex dynamic from 1942 to 1944. Despite these tensions, the overall alliance remained peaceful. The Cold War era brought additional challenges to Franco-American relations, particularly during the 1950s and 1960s. Disagreements arose over military conflicts like the Vietnam War and the Suez Crisis, as well as issues related to European security and NATO's role. These geopolitical tensions influenced public perception, with some French people viewing Americans as square, helpful, generous, and kind, while others were more critical. French opinions about the Germans were equally multifaceted and influenced by the events of World War II. During the war, France had its share of domestic traitors who collaborated with the Nazi regime. Collaboration occurred for various reasons, including racism, opportunism, and anti-communism. Some were coerced into working with the Germans, while others aligned voluntarily with the occupiers. The Vichy government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain and Pierre Laval, controlled the occupied part of France as a puppet government for the Nazis. This regime was responsible for deporting 76,000 Jews to extermination camps, a dark chapter in France's history that left lasting scars on the nation's conscience. Despite the war's tensions, post-war relations between France and Germany evolved positively. France played a crucial role in shaping the occupation zones in Germany and in the reconstruction process. Franco-German friendship deepened over time, emphasizing cross-border cooperation and shared interests. This partnership became a pillar of European unity and stability, symbolizing a significant transformation from enmity to alliance. Public perception of Americans in post-war France was influenced by several factors. The significant aid and military support provided by the United States during the war were appreciated by many. American culture, personified by Hollywood movies, jazz music, and consumer goods, also had a substantial impact on French society. This cultural influence was often seen as a positive aspect of the American presence. However, there were also negative experiences. The presence of American troops in France was not without problems. Reports of looting, rape, and other misconduct by some Allied soldiers led to resentment and a tarnished image of the liberators. These incidents contributed to a complex and sometimes contradictory view of Americans among the French population. The Cold War further complicated Franco-American relations. The ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union placed France in a challenging position. French leaders, particularly Charles de Gaulle, sought to maintain an independent foreign policy, often at odds with American interests. Disagreements over military interventions, such as the Vietnam War, and issues like the Suez Crisis highlighted the divergent approaches of the two nations. Despite these tensions, The alliance between France and the United States remained strong. The shared history of collaboration during World War II and mutual interest in countering Soviet influence in Europe provided a foundation for continued cooperation. The establishment of NATO and other international organizations further solidified this partnership. Public perception of Americans by the French varied widely. While some admired the spirit of innovation, generosity, and vibrant American culture, others were critical of perceived American arrogance and unilateralism. This duality reflected the broader complexities in Franco-American relations. French opinions about Germans after the war were shaped by the need to reconcile with a former enemy. The immediate post-war period was marked by a desire for justice and retribution against those who had collaborated with the Nazis. The liberation of France and its aftermath were marked by complex and evolving opinions about both Germans and Americans. The experiences of occupation, collaboration, and liberation left lasting impressions on the French population. The post-war period saw efforts to address these complexities through legal proceedings, reconciliation initiatives, and the rebuilding of international relationships. The nuanced views of the French towards their wartime allies and enemies reflect the broader challenges of navigating a world transformed by conflict and striving for a future of peace and cooperation. From liberation to retribution, post-liberation reprisals in France. After the liberation of France, the nation faced the arduous task of reconciling with the events of the occupation. This period was marked by a wave of reprisals against those who had collaborated with the Nazi regime. The actions taken during this time were complex and often driven by a mix of justice, vengeance, and the need to restore national pride and integrity. The initial response to collaboration was swift and harsh. This wild phase began even before the official liberation, when resistance fighters and ordinary citizens took matters into their own hands. Public executions and improvised trials were common. Many suspected collaborators were summarily executed without formal proceedings. These spontaneous acts of retribution reflected the deep anger and desire for immediate justice among the French population. As the country began to stabilize, the provisional government led by Charles de Gaulle sought to bring order to the retribution process. The legal purge that followed aimed to provide a more structured and legal approach to addressing collaboration. Approximately 120,000 individuals were sentenced for their actions during the occupation. This phase included high-profile trials that sought to hold accountable those who had played significant roles in collaborating with the Nazis. Marshal Philippe Pétain, leader of the Vichy government, faced trial for his collaboration with the Germans. Pétain, once a World War I hero, was convicted and sentenced to death, though his sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment. His trial was a focal point for the French people, symbolizing the betrayal and moral failures of the Vichy regime. French novelist Louis-Ferdinand Céline, known for his anti-Semitic writings and collaborationist views, also faced legal consequences. His trial and subsequent punishment highlighted the cultural and intellectual dimensions of collaboration, extending beyond political and military spheres. One of the most visible and controversial aspects of post-liberation reprisals was the public humiliation of women accused of having romantic relationships with German soldiers. These women, often labeled as horizontal collaborators, were subjected to the indignity of having their heads shaved in public. This act served as both punishment and symbolic stripping of their alleged betrayal. The shorn women were paraded through the streets, jeered by crowds. This form of social punishment was intended to shame and ostracize them, reinforcing the community's condemnation of their actions. Public shaming also extended to other collaborators. Those who had profited from the black market during the occupation were stigmatized as war profiteers. These individuals were often subjected to public denunciations and social ostracism. The black market had been a vital lifeline for many during the harsh years of occupation, but those who had excessively profited were seen as exploiters of their compatriots' suffering. The drive for justice and retribution did not focus solely on individuals. The provisional government also took steps to dismantle institutions and structures associated with the Vichy regime. This included purging the civil service and other public institutions of those who had collaborated. The aim was to restore the integrity of the French state and ensure it was free from the stain of collaboration. As the immediate post-liberation period gave way to long-term reconstruction, the fervor for retribution began to wane. The need for reconciliation and national unity became more pressing. The third phase of dealing with collaborators was characterized by a more lenient and pragmatic approach. The focus shifted from punishment to understanding and integration. Many sentences were commuted, and efforts were made to reintegrate former collaborators into society. This period of leniency was not without controversy. For some, it represented a necessary step towards healing and moving forward. For others, it was seen as a betrayal of justice and a failure to adequately punish those who had betrayed their country. This tension reflected the broader complexities of French society as it grappled with the legacies of occupation and collaboration. The process of addressing collaboration and its aftermath was also influenced by the broader geopolitical context. The onset of the Cold War brought new priorities and alliances. The need for a stable and united Western Europe to counter Soviet influence meant that harsh retribution gave way to reconciliation and cooperation. France's role in shaping post-war Europe, particularly through its partnership with Germany, underscored the importance of overcoming past divisions. Public memory and historical narratives about liberation and reprisals continued to evolve in the decades following the war. The early patriotic myth that all of France had resisted and liberated itself gradually gave way to more nuanced understandings of the complexities and ambiguities of occupation. Historians and scholars began to explore the varied experiences of collaboration, resistance, and survival. The legacy of post-liberation reprisals remains a contentious and sensitive topic in France. The period is remembered both as one of justice and excess, where the lines between right and wrong were often blurred. The actions taken during this time were driven by a deep desire to reclaim national honor and ensure that the horrors of occupation were not forgotten. The legacy of these reprisals continues to shape French memory and identity, serving as a reminder of the difficult and often painful process of confronting the past. Behind the front lines in Normandy, chaos and misconduct. As the troops advanced, the realities of life behind the front lines became increasingly complex. The initial momentum of the invasion gradually gave way to the exhausting and chaotic nature of sustained combat operations. While the front lines were scenes of intense fighting and strategic maneuvers, the areas immediately behind them often descended into disorder. It was in these rear areas that cases of chaos and misconduct among American soldiers began to proliferate, highlighting the challenges of maintaining discipline in a rapidly evolving war zone. There were instances of indiscipline among the troops, including fights between soldiers, alcohol and drug abuse, and acts of gratuitous violence against civilians and other military personnel. Life magazine reported that the widespread view American troops had of France was of a tremendous brothel inhabited by 40 million hedonists who spent all their time eating, drinking, making love, and generally having an incredibly good time. In September 1944, Major General Charles H. Gerhardt, commander of the 29th Infantry Division, set up a brothel called the Blue and Grey Corral near the town of Saint-Renan, partly to counter a wave of rape accusations against American soldiers. It was closed after just 5 hours to prevent civilians in the United States from learning of a military-run brothel's existence. The High Command of the Free French Forces sent a letter of complaint to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, asking him to order his commanders to take action against all accusations of murder, rape, assault, robbery, and other crimes. In August 1945, Pierre Voisin, mayor of Le Havre, urged Colonel Thomas Weed, the American commander in the region, to establish brothels on the outskirts of Le Havre. However, the American commanders refused. The Normandy countryside, with its dense hedgerows and narrow roads, created a difficult and unpredictable battlefield. This terrain not only slowed the advance of American troops, but also provided ample cover for German defenders. As a result, progress was often measured in yards rather than miles, and the fighting was brutal and at close quarters. In such an environment, the stress and exhaustion of continuous combat took a heavy toll on the soldiers. Behind the front lines, the situation was no less challenging. Supply lines were constantly under threat from German counterattacks, and the movement of troops and equipment was a logistical nightmare. Amid this chaos, maintaining military discipline proved difficult. Reports of looting, theft, and other forms of misconduct began to emerge more frequently. Some soldiers, struggling to cope with the stress of battle, turned to alcohol, which further exacerbated the problem. From the outset, the arrival of the American army was met with mixed emotions by the local population. The sight of Allied troops brought relief and hope to many, but the chaos of war also introduced new anxieties and dangers. Civilians who had been caught in the crossfire of intense battles now dealt with the aftermath. Destroyed homes, disrupted lives, and the ever-present fear of further violence. Amid this turmoil, reports of looting, theft, and other forms of misconduct began to surface. For many French civilians who had suffered under German occupation, the realization that their new protectors could also be perpetrators of crimes was a bitter pill to swallow. There were tensions between American soldiers and members of the French resistance, sometimes due to cultural misunderstandings or conflicts over military strategy and the distribution of supplies. However, it is also necessary to understand that the Americans had to consider the viewpoint of de Gaulle, who viewed the participation of French communists within the resistance with suspicion and sought to limit their influence to prevent them from taking control of the country after liberation. After the news of D-Day, the Maquis attempted to seize the strongholds, particularly on the Vercors Plateau. Eugène Chavant, the head of the FFI in the Isère region, ordered all Maquis bands to concentrate on the Vercors Plateau after learning of D-Day. By June 9, 1944, about 3,000 Maquisards had responded to the call, and on July 3, 1944, the Free Republic of Vercors was proclaimed. Although the Allies attempted to send supplies by air to the strongholds and the Maquis fought valiantly, all these operations ended with the resistance defeated. By mid-June, the Wehrmacht had wrested the town of Saint-Nizier-du-Moucherotte from the Maquis du Vercors, cutting off the link between the Vercors Plateau and Grenoble. To celebrate Bastille Day, the U.S. Army Air Force sent 360 B-17 planes to drop weapon supplies to the Maquisards on the Vercors Plateau. However, the weapons dropped by the Americans were all light weapons, and Chavant sent a radio message to Algiers on the night of July 21, 1944, asking for heavy weapons to be airdropped. He called the leaders in Algiers criminals and cowards for not organizing more support, ending with the phrase, "That is what we are saying, criminals and cowards." In the Battle of the Vercors Plateau, the SS landed a glider company and the Maquis suffered heavy losses. Many of the German units fighting in Vercors were Ostlegionen, Eastern Legions, prisoners of war from the Red Army, mostly Russians and Ukrainians, who had joined the SS after being captured in 1942 or 1943. By this point, the Germans had already suffered such heavy losses on the Eastern Front that they needed the manpower of the Ostlegionen to make up for it. While the same Alpine division that had taken the Glières Plateau in March stormed the Vercors Plateau supported by a tank unit based in Lyon, the SS landed in gliders. The Maquis had around 650 dead during the fighting on the Vercors Plateau, and afterward the Germans executed about 200 Maquisards, mostly wounded who had not been able to escape along with the medical staff who had stayed behind to care for them. After the Battle of Vercors, the local population was the victim of massive reprisals, including numerous cases of looting, rape, and extrajudicial executions. At times, American officers might have ordered the resistance to kill German soldiers. According to the testimony of Edmond Reville, a former French resistance fighter, who in June 1944 was 19 years old, 47 German soldiers and a 20-year-old woman accused of being a collaborator were killed by members of the French resistance. The events allegedly took place in Meymac in Corrèze and are dated June 12, 1944. After being executed, the bodies were buried in mass graves. At that time, while the Normandy landings were taking place on the night of June 5th, Limousin had been one of the most important centers of resistance in France for several years. On June 7th and 8th, German army soldiers were captured by the resistance in Corrèze, but that month of June was very bloody in the region. On the 9th, a massacre took place in the town of Toul with the hanging of 99 civilians and the deportation of 149 men to Dachau. A day later, 47 French resistance fighters were machine-gunned by the Germans in Ussel in Corrèze. That same day, the town of Oradour-sur-Glane in Haute-Vienne was destroyed and its inhabitants massacred. 643 adults and children were burned in the church. All these ruthless and atrocious acts against entire towns logically generated a feeling of vengeance. The German soldiers had been taken prisoner during the events of June 7th and 8, 1944, in Toul. They had been captured by the Maquis. Edmond Reville recounts, "We had 47 Wehrmacht soldiers left, plus a girl. A French woman who was around 20 years old also died. She had collaborated with the Germans. Each voluntary resistance fighter killed his own German. I didn't participate in it. There were 3 or 4 of us who didn't participate. We refused. This happened during a morning. They fell into the hole they had dug themselves. We were not aware of what we were doing. We were too young. We never talked about it again. It remained a secret. We had no structure to guard them. We were supervised by an American or English commander who gave the order to shoot them." Looting became a common occurrence in the areas immediately behind the front lines. Abandoned homes and businesses were ransacked for valuables and supplies. While some soldiers took only what they needed to survive, others saw an opportunity for personal gain. This behavior not only violated military regulations, but also undermined the trust and goodwill of the local population. Theft was not limited to material goods. There were also reports of soldiers appropriating food and livestock from local farms, leaving residents without essential resources. In a war-torn landscape where every bite of food and head of livestock was crucial for survival, these actions had severe consequences for the affected communities. The US Army, seen as liberators, sometimes inflicted more suffering on those they were supposed to protect. Alcohol played a significant role in the misconduct behind the front lines. The availability of wine and spirits in the French countryside provided a tempting escape for battle-weary soldiers. Intoxication led to fights, reckless behavior, and a breakdown in unit cohesion. Commanders struggled to maintain order as the effects of alcohol exacerbated the stress and trauma of combat. In some cases, drunken soldiers became violent, leading to incidents of assault and harassment of both civilians and fellow soldiers. Sexual violence was another grim aspect of the misconduct behind the front lines. Efforts to address these issues were hampered by the fluid and unpredictable nature of the campaign. Commanders were often more focused on immediate military objectives than policing their troops. Courts-martial and disciplinary actions were carried out, but the scale of the problem made consistent enforcement of justice difficult. Additionally, the need to maintain morale and fighting strength sometimes led to leniency with offenders, further complicating efforts to curb misconduct. French authorities, including local officials and members of the resistance, tried to address these issues by coordinating with the US military command. They provided detailed reports of incidents, hoping that action would be taken to curb the misconduct. However, the immense scale of the operation and ongoing battles made it difficult for US command to prioritize these concerns. Efforts were made to discipline offenders, but the effectiveness of these measures varied. The misconduct behind the front lines had lasting repercussions. It strained the relationship between the US Army and the French civilians, who had initially welcomed the liberators with open arms. The actions of a few soldiers cast a shadow over the entire force, creating a complex legacy of liberation mixed with suffering. For many French civilians, memories of the American advance through Normandy were tainted by these acts of chaos and violence. The rape of French women, a dark chapter in D-Day.